Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to our Watershed Talks, October 28th, and Clean Water and Policy, Finding Common Ground with Dane Schumann, who is an attorney and a lobbyist, and he's also a lobbyist with several other organizations, but with the Izaak Walton League's Iowa division. So we are super excited to have him with us this evening and appreciate him taking out time. We're going to be talking about how to find common ground for water. How can we all figure out how we can unite and make this uh, front and center for Iowa, for public health, recreation, and all of our waterways. The Izaak Walton League Iowa Division recently started a GoFundMe campaign to help keep the University of Iowa's world-class water monitoring systems alive. And this is a bipartisan collaboration. And we know this is absolutely key to protecting us for our for long term. And that's what Dane's going to help us break down this evening is how we can, work together and really let everybody know that we're all in this together, whether we're Democrats, Republicans, or independents, or just common community members that care about our waterways. Just to remind everybody, the Izaak Walton League was founded to defend our waterways and natural resources over 100 years ago. And together, let's renew that mission and find common ground for Iowa's clean water future. So without further ado, I will let Dane take it away. Thank you again, Dane. We're super grateful to have you with us this Tuesday evening.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for having me. Thanks for everybody who's taking time out of their schedule to come listen to me visit with you about this. And hopefully my slide presentation isn't too long. I tend to like to stay on the short side of things to leave time for questions and hopefully some answers. But your questions are welcome at the end, certainly.
Oh, and
As
I
Christine
meant
said,
to.
I'm Dane Schumann. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to, and I just wanted to do a shout out to Chris Henning, who's helping us co-host this evening, and she'll be helping with the question and answer. So thank you, Chris. For those of you who don't know who Chris is, a lot of our regulars do. Thank you again, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dane. Thanks.
No problem. So as Christine said, I'm attorney and also a lobbyist up at the Capitol. The Izaak Walton League's been a client of mine for a few years now. And before that, before representing them, I have represented other clients kind of in this space also. So it's an issue near and dear to my heart. And I wanted to spend some time. Are the slides going through okay? You see the overview one now? Okay. Talking a little, just an overview where what I'd like to talk about is, kind of where we are. I think a lot of us know what we can expect. I think realistically, at least from my vantage point, up at the Capitol and the legislature, what can help us. And for that, I've always kind of pledged that if I had the opportunity to have a talk like this, I would kind of geek out on a little topic that you'll get a sense of tonight that hopefully isn't too dorky, but it is, I think, something helpful and topical for what we're discussing. And really, why does monitoring matter? Monitoring the water that we're all talking about, and this campaign that the Izaak Walton League is engaged in to fund the sensors, and Polk County and others have helped with, and are in the midst of gathering more support across the state to make a difference, and hopefully maybe at the state level can leverage funds for that also. So to get started, I thought I'd just present a simplified timeline for how we got here. A lot of you are aware of the nutrient reduction strategy being introduced in 2013, kind of under the auspices of Iowa State, being authored there, kind of on a thought, I guess, with some actions that were done by the EPA over in the Chesapeake, that there was going to be a similar set of load regulations going into the Mississippi River that they were going to authorize or implement, and the states like Iowa had to respond to that. And so out of that came the nutrient reduction. And then the Des Moines Waterworks litigation, of course, I think in my mind, at least up at the Capitol, that was a large, pardon the pun, but a watershed moment where there were a lot of major new attention brought to the issue, good, bad, or otherwise. And it somewhat culminated, I think, with the passage of water quality legislation in the beginning of 2018 with the passage of Senate File 512. You can see on there that provides some level of water quality funding, really to help, I think, mainly municipalities kind of clean water, and also to provide some conservation efforts for farmers with cost share. And we can debate whether or not that's been helpful or not. But that's the main thing that kind of came out of that policy-wise after the Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit was dismissed in federal court. And then, of course, in 2023, we had the funding removed from the water quality that previously had resided in the state. I think the progress that we've made in Iowa is probably disputed, depending on whom you talk to. There are more cover crops, there are more conservation practices probably in place, but how much of an effect it's had, I think, is subject to reasonable debate, and where you stand on that probably depends a lot on where you sit. But that's, I think, fair to say the reality. When we look at the Des Moines Waterworks running their nitrate removal facility this summer, again, pretty much just like they were 10 years ago. That's a data point that I think points in a certain direction for us all. So, obviously I'm a lobbyist and I get asked a lot, what can the legislature do to change this? And of course, they technically can change the law and adjust what's going on. But, I think practically speaking, there's probably not something that they're definitely going to come along and change for us in terms of having, mandatory buffer strips or penalizing farmers further for at least this current makeup of the legislature, penalizing farmers for runoff or fish kills. We've got a situation with the DNR that, in terms of their FTEs and how they operate, that isn't the envy of any agency in the state. And that's just where we are, sort of, I think, politically up at the state house and maybe on a certain level around the state more generally. Some people ask, would a partisan shift in the legislature help us if we had more Democrats, maybe controlling a chamber or a new governor that wasn't a Republican? Would that help? I'm somewhat skeptical that would, in terms of having a big piece of policy that would go through and change everything for us, in terms of adjusting that sort of fundamental dynamic that we have in a state like Iowa, where, if you read a Bloomberg News article that came out 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think Christine's mentioned it, and I sent it out to some of you that are probably on this talking about just the power that the agricultural industry in the state has, and that here, and also as manifested up at the legislature. There's agricultural economics that stand in the way of that. There's electoral consequences potentially for legislators who want to make a dramatic change. And so do some of the bigger things that we talk about sometimes with wanting to change some of these dynamics, it's very, very difficult for the legislature to do that or to count on them. So if we can't change the law, which basically at this point by default says that there's a right to pollute nutrients into the waterways through, as evidenced by the Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit dismissal, right? That lawsuit was brought against drainage districts in Northwest Iowa, trying to call them point source polluters under the Clean Water Act, and say that they had to be regulated as such, just like a piece of industry, a section of industry would be if they pollute into a river. They basically affirmed the fact that they can do that. If that's the case, then we have to, I think, maybe accept that and understand that if the legislature isn't going to fundamentally solve or change that dynamic, maybe we have to do something that accepts that that's the reality and appreciate sort of that the issue is somewhat solved for us. And you might look at me like I'm crazy and say that the issue is solved by that. But what I mean is that I think we probably need a better method of dealing with it, coping with it, and making changes where we can and prioritizing the changes we want to make in a fashion that's probably politically realistic in this state and also leads to good results for us who care about it. And so this is where I'm going to geek out a little bit. There is a why am I talking about an economist who's died 15 years ago? He was really influential, a guy named Ronald Coase, who talked about when he won the Nobel Prize about if you have got clear rights to something and you have cheap bargaining costs among people, it allows you to solve or at least partially solve pollution problems themselves. So it's not going to be a quiz at the end on who Ronald Coase was or what he thought, but I wanted to give credit where credit was due to this thinker because, as I mentioned, we do have some things solved for us in terms of this problem and how we want to think about it. Fundamentally, I think what we need is a movement, either it be grassroots or, and it probably will need help from the legislature in some sense, but a movement where people can negotiate solutions themselves, not at the legislature necessarily, but through different entities that we might be able to set up. And we're partially there in one sense. We have clearly defined rights in the sense that we know that there's a right to grow crops and raise livestock. And unfortunately, good, bad, or otherwise, probably bad, they have the ability to pollute when they do it. And if you look at what Des Moines Waterworks has to do to their water or what any other utility has to do to their water, when they get it and it's polluted, they, in essence, don't have a right to have water cleaned. They have to, and a fisherman doesn't necessarily have a right to have a clear trout stream. And people don't necessarily have rights to have good lakes to go ski or fish or boat on. Because when it's that way, there's nothing that we can do in terms of legal recourse to really recoup anything. So it's in green here, not because it's good, but because we know that that's the case. If we're going to have a system where we can deal with that, though, if we think about, put our economics hat on about how we deal with those issues, we need to have low transactions costs amongst the people who care about water quality and the people that are either polluting or want the water to be clean, to be able to deal with each other and to be able to exchange information and to, as economists like Coase or others talk about, lower the transactions costs. And right now, today, those costs are impossibly high. There's farmers across the state growing crops everywhere, raising livestock, applying nitrogen, phosphorus, spreading manure, and all of those things. They might do it in a way that's good or bad, but it's going on. And landowners or utilities or groups like the Izaak Walton League, you name it, have a very difficult time of communicating with those people who are causing those issues for us, what it is we'd prefer to see otherwise, other than kind of going to the legislature. And I think that is not a place fundamentally where we're going to get a great deal of change on it. But what we need to be able to do is to establish some of these mechanisms where there can be communication and there can be a sharing of information, of which monitoring is a big part of it, in order to lower those costs so that people, real life, everyday people, can negotiate with others. And by negotiate, I mean get together and have a dialogue and talk to each other about what would be helpful and what their preferences are. They need to know what information matters. They need to be able to share it. And if you think about it, I would challenge anyone to think of ways in which any of that goes on in this state right now, other than the echo chamber at the Capitol, which isn't very efficient for that. I really struggle to think of one. And that's what I think, given the situation we're at here in Iowa and other states across the country that are much like us, at least on some level. It wouldn't solve it, but it could be helpful. So it's not an entirely new idea, and I'm not entirely crazy to think this, because I mentioned Senate File 512 at the beginning of the talk, which was the bill that got passed. There was another one that competed with that the House Republicans passed. I think it was House File 612 that ultimately didn't become law. But it would have provided funding basically at the WMA level or at the HUC 12 level. It dealt with different HUCs and gave utilities an ability to come together and individuals to deal with farmers, drainage districts, landowners, and it provided funding in high priority areas that we all kind of know what they are, right? The Des Moines Lobe is an obvious one. Others there that might be environmentally impacted, more poignantly than others, for people to come together and precisely do that. There is always a funding need, and I think that's important to keep in mind. But Senate File 512, which we have right now, provides funding, but it's really all done through eyeballs, and there's not a lot of accountability for how the dollars are spent, and I think that's a fair criticism of that. But what I'm talking about, and I think what the author of House File 612 and some of its supporters had in mind back in the day, was creating the atmosphere, the environment where folks can come together and deal with water quality issues in a way that's localized, but also share information and exchange their preferences about what needs to be done in order to make things better. Because I think a lot of times there's a disconnect between a farmer implements a practice and doesn't really have a very strong idea of what the impact is one way or another downstream. A utility may wish for fewer nitrates in the water. Fishermen may wish for cleaner water, but who do you speak to about that? And that's the fundamental issue that I think we face, and that is, I think, one method of trying to fix it. And so, of course, those negotiation costs are reduced, right, by good information. And that's where I think water quality monitoring comes into play most poignantly. Fundamentally, it just has to be measured. But one of the things that you'd be asking people to do then at that point is to, if we were to implement the thing I'm talking about, the kind of vision I have at least, or the vision that some of the water quality bill sponsors had, almost 10 years ago, is that if nobody can agree how much maybe a given reduction has achieved in practice, but if we're monitoring, we can learn and everybody can negotiate on the same facts and discuss with each other on the same facts of what that given tactic might do in order to be helpful downstream, or if it might be too costly for a farmer to impose it on himself. We need to have that information. The other beauty of course, monitoring is that it's not always, we can have information, but of course it might not always be shared or verified across all the parties that are dealing with it and that care about the topic. And so the more funding there, or excuse me, the more monitoring there is, the more entities that are involved in it, they've got a common ground of facts to share with each other and verify across time and across space. The other thing, of course, not so much a monitoring tactic, or a monitoring perk, but is the proposal I'm discussing is something where landowners and farmers are, oftentimes are dealt with individually as we have things set up now. But if we have something where they're dealt with more holistically, perhaps on the WMA scale, Watershed Management Authority scale, individual practices are bundled as projects, and you can have templates for, completing them in one place, and then the WMA next door can do it the same way. The one next door to that can do it the same way with a few changes perhaps to accommodate the topography or the farmer's preferences or the needs of people in that watershed that need their changes, or need their voices heard and need changes made. And of course, monitoring is fundamental to really all of those things, right? Without it, it's extremely difficult to be able to have any kind of assessment about what's working, and to ask people to put their own money behind the projects or the effort. So we have to monitor, just because there's a simple need for information about water quality. And that dovetails a little bit, I think, part of what we fight about with monitoring, part of the fear that I think is out there that, got the sensors funding taken away in 2023 was it's the bad data is out there in public view all the time. And so certain folks and organizations don't want it to be seen. I think on its own, it's good that the funding, or excuse me, that the monitoring is there and that people can see for themselves, or if they go on their websites I forget the acronym of the organization's name within the university, but that people can see for themselves what's out there. The news media can report it, and this topic doesn't recede from public view. Of course, as I mentioned too, it creates a framework for things with folks. If we're going to have some kind of a system where there's a collaboration by stakeholders who care about this issue, we have to have monitoring that provides that framework for how we make all those things work. And as I'm going to talk next on the next slide, I think if we have a system like this in place, it's essential to probably have it in place in advance of having any kind of meaningful water quality problems addressed at the state level, by allowing that, where the state can incentivize and allow people to solve these problems amongst themselves, or at least try to make a dent in them. So I go back to one of the slides at the beginning. Can the legislature change this? The monitoring is good on its own, but it's also an important framework. And I think that to the extent that, as I've mentioned, if there's anything that can be done, we're probably are not going to be successful in fundamentally changing the legal framework that we have here in Iowa, or really in the Midwest, when it comes to farming and the right to pollute in the process of farming. But I think that is probably a political reality. But as I mentioned, there are ways that we can address it and at least dampen the impact, if not make meaningful progress towards resolution for what we want. That isn't mutually exclusive with the interests of farmers or the agricultural community or our friends who grow livestock and corn and soybeans for a living. But I think monitoring is essential to any effort in order to make that work. And so if the legislature were to do something where they're not going to change the laws in terms of the rights to farmers to be able to do what they want, and that regime is going to stay in place, then how is it then that we as citizens or stakeholders, utilities, outdoor organizations, farmers, landowners can come together to address these topics and these issues as we find them more locally or at a watershed level? We need to have monitoring in order to do it. And because and we need to have monitoring in order to do it, because when people come together to make those plans or to do those things, they need to have information that's good about what it is they're trying to accomplish. And that's part of it. That's the fundamental reason for it. I think if we were to approach the problem in that fashion, where we're hoping folks can get together and make these changes of what the impact of certain farming practices are, what the impact, good, bad, or otherwise, of certain conservation practices are, that will be helpful. And I think my hope would be also, and this is not so much for a legislative discussion, but that there's a change to sort of our culture here in this state, or maybe around the Midwest. I'm from northern Iowa, from Franklin County. I grew up on a farm. I visit there somewhat often. I remember when the Des Moines Waterworks litigation was going on, there were farmers that would or people connected with farming would ask, "What's nitrate? What's phosphorus?" Or the quote I often get, and that's a real one, is that the lakes are dirty here just because they simply are, not because they've been polluted as we know. There has to be a cultural shift, I think, in terms of wanting to be stewards and not just to be called good stewards, but to actually want to be one. And we have to measure what we're doing to know that we are in fact good stewards of our water and our land. Um, because without it, then we can think we're doing it and want to try, but if we're not measuring, we're not going to fundamentally know that we actually are. And uh, hopefully, I've tied it back after talking about Ronald Coase and economics and my and a little bit of a history lesson as to what I think is important today or as we go forward. But and it might not be a rah-rah talk that says that we can accomplish anything we want, but I think it is realistic to expect that there is hope for us if we understand that there is a way for us to come together and deal with these things. And I think everyone um, wants to, on some level, deal with this problem. There are some who don't, and there might be individual farmers who may not, or bad actors out there. But I think most of us want to do the right thing and want to know that we're doing the right thing. And monitoring is one of the main methods by which we can do that, and hopefully have a framework for doing so in the future. And with that, I think that's it. It is.
Uh, thank you so much, Dane, for giving us your perspective. As some of you know, the GoFundMe campaign is really not to actually try to fund the monitors long term. It's a stopgap because the University of Iowa uh, has funding that runs out mid 2026. So we're just trying to help, give a little cushion and give a little time so we can work on legislation to get the monitors back on and let people be a little bit more educated why, this has happened and so forth. And since we started, Polk County Conservation has approved, their Board of Supervisors has approved $200,000 to go toward that as well. And there's a possibility that a few other uh, county conservation boards are going to be doing that. But obviously, uh, we feel that, the state should be overseeing this too and be quite involved. That is the hope, is that, what we, like as you pointed out, how are we going to move forward without knowing the real situation? And I think it's pretty much common knowledge that there are people in the current administration at the Capitol that do not want to see the numbers that are there because some of the numbers, are not good, but at the same time, a few of them are good because it shows where the conservation is working in some areas, and those should be highlighted, as well as the problematic areas as well. So I know we might have some questions. This is kind of a hot topic right now, and we really would like to figure out, how we can all work together on this. I must say that we do have both Republicans and Democrats in the Izaak Walton League, and many of the Republicans are not happy with this whole situation, and they are upset about our water quality issues and our crisis in the state. I have some other friends, and how do we bridge this? Because it's been, even though we say it's not political, but in some ways it is, sometimes we feel like that. And especially in today's political climate, how are we ever going to be able to make change on the ground here when we have, there's so many cards stacked against moving forward in a collaborative way? And you know how difficult it is. Is there anything that you can suggest that people can do to work with their representatives and let them know that this matters and that this needs to be a top priority for both recreation and public health? I don't know. And I think there's going to be some other questions And if others have some questions, please write them in the chat box or raise your hand, and Chris is going to help field those questions. But that's my initial thought. Yeah, you're still muted. There you go.
My suggestion for how to make this an issue for legislators is it's a really simple one. I mean, they do listen to what people say back home, and it's, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I mean, it is important for them to hear from constituents. And so emails, phone calls, showing up at a, town hall event where they're there, especially during session, they tend to have a lot of them. Or just simply hearing from you in terms of sending an email and saying, I'm from, disagree with you guys, discontinuing funding for the water quality monitoring across the state. I want you to do something about that. It doesn't have to be super complicated or technical in nature, what you communicate to them, but just showing them that you care goes a long ways. And it's no magic formula to it. That's just simply simply the best way to do it. As you know, and it's one of the things I mentioned too, in terms of, I think, kind of changing some of the cultural attitudes that we have around the state. And this isn't so much political as much as it is just a, cultural observation. But there is, there are groups out there that, as you were sort of alluding to, Christine, that really don't want to see this problem solved, or maybe the solution is the problem for them. And I think that's unfortunate. And I think that, a really important cultural aspect of it all is to not have that view, and is instead to rather have one that's viewed based on an understanding that there is a space here where water quality and conservation and caring about the environment coexists alongside productive, economically gainful agricultural practices. So and some members or some folks that are part of the Izaak Walton League might be closely either have friends who are farmers, of course, or family who are, and those people might be part of some of these groups that make up kind of the agenda up at the legislature. But I think one by one, that we can kind of make those connections with folks and help them understand it. Because as I mentioned on the last slide, there are still a lot of people who don't think there's an issue, and it's kind of shocking.
So Rob Davis in the chat has asked a question, and Rob, if I don't get this right, you'll pop in, okay? Is there an opportunity this legislative cycle that has been reviewed prior to the session and has incorporated feedback on how to reconcile funding, the amount and mode of delivery, and eligible practice differences? Now, are you talking about, Rob, are you talking about specific monitors or farming practices?
Well, I'm speaking to farming practices.
Okay. So Dane, do you have something that you want to?
I'm not aware of a bill. I guess I'm not aware of a specific bill that's going to be introduced. There could be one. It's a little early to know. The pre-filing deadline isn't for quite some time. That's in December. Those aren't always public, and then you don't always get kind of a good sense of what every bill is going to be introduced until, well, it kind of happens all through session, but at least until January, or well into it. In terms of just kind of the general topic of, what Rob's alluding to, there's been some pushback, I think, with kind of the water quality effort in general at the Capitol to not have, to not, I guess, reconcile funding or think about eligible practices all that closely. There's been some on the practices where I don't pretend to be an environmental engineer, but where maybe some things like bioreactors really aren't looked on with what cover crops or buffer strips might be. And so perhaps those are funded at, with more eagerly from the Senate File 512 funding that's available now out there for producers. But in terms of like kind of holistically thinking about those things, it's really been kind of the purview of IDOLs as they administer the 30 plus million dollars a year that's available for water quality efforts. And there's a little more than that too. There's other programs, of course, out there, but that's kind of where that reconciliation and consideration reside at this point, is outside the legislature and really with IDOLs and somewhat with the DNR.
Do you know if there are certain legislators who are more receptive than others?
Yeah, there are. I think, I mentioned in the talk that or in the presentation that there was one bill that got through that was a Senate file, and so you can imagine that came from the Senate chamber, and another one that was from the House that maybe was going to approach it a little bit better, a little bit differently. The personalities have changed a lot. There's been a lot of turnover. Of course, there always is, really each election cycle. And there's been a lot since 2017, 2018. But there are still legislators, I think, who understand, I think, or at least have an issue with maybe a lack of accountability that we have with the state providing some cost share without really monitoring progress. And the way, of course, a lot of it's done is through modeling what the impact of certain conservation practices might have downstream, and that's difficult to do. There's no substitute to just simply monitoring something, right, and actually measuring it. And there are people who understand that point. The question is kind of one of will up there. Is, this issue was dealt with in 2017-18. There were large, industry organizations that wanted to see the Senate file go through and have the system that we have now, and not do much more than that. But there are voices up there that do, I think, kind of see the issue that we're discussing.
So I'm going to ask this one because I notice a lot of publicity and a lot of work around the CISRA Polk County study that just came out, 6-8 weeks ago, and then the $200,000 from Polk County for funding monitors. What do you think we can do between now and then to get that even more in the public eye and in the legislators' eye?
Well, it's in the eye of legislators. Understand, they know about this going on. I know that for a fact, or at least not all 150 of them, but certain important ones do. It's partly my job to make sure that they understand that also, and that it's a priority for groups like yours and others out there. I think, it's part of it also is to show, I think, one, this is more of a concrete comment that I'd make about it, is showing them, I think, from their perspective, right, trying to put on the legislators' cap of saying, well, why is this valuable to the state, and really kind of just trying to actually make that case as to why the dollars are important for them to spend. Their sense of things sometimes, I think, and I know I get that it's flawed, or it might be, is that, well, groups like the Des Moines Waterworks, they already measure nitrates in the water, and then if it's too high, they remove them. And so why do we have to spend money on monitoring across the state if it's only a problem for the utility that needs to remove the nitrates? Of course, there's more to it than that, right? And there's other reasons why those monitors are important. And I think along with, as I mentioned before, making sure legislators know we care about this, also making the case as to why it's not just about that, but it's verification for the fact that we're spending money across the state on conservation practices that may or may not be having a very strong impact. And these monitors go a long ways towards helping us make that assessment. There is a sense that the monitors, and I think it's incorrect, but that they might be duplicative or they're not worth it. And it's important to make that case too.
All right, thanks. There's a question from Maggie McGowan, who's in the Nishnabotna. Boy, my tongue's not working today on all these long words. In the Nishnabotna Water Defenders meeting, the state senator took issue with the topic of CAFOs contributing to the water quality, and that he thought that there were regulations in place and that CAFO owners need to adhere to those regulations. But the violations seem to be the very small fines and minimal corrective actions. And are these regulations effective, and is the oversight effective in your opinion?
In theory, I guess they can be effective, but in practice, there's how many CAFOs across the state? Well over 1,000, 1,500. I don't know the number. That's a lot. And the DNR is tasked with enforcing those regulations, and I think there's just a handful of people that are basically enforcement folks with the DNR on CAFOs. So the likelihood that they're going to go take a site visit is extremely low. The one place where there is, I think kind of meaningful regulation in the beginning is that there needs to be a manure management plan for them, of course, and that's probably where, in terms of manure hauling, where there is an impact on water quality. But the manure management plan really isn't, no operator's really held to it unless there's a crisis, right? Unless there's an accident or there's something that happens that people know about, that then they get held to account for not following it, and maybe not even then, right? So I would, I guess, politely disagree that that's the case, but that's so. There are regulations, sure, but then you hear about things where there's giant fish kills, right? And the fine is, if they're caught, is $5,000 to $10,000 in the Turkey River. What's that say about how we, again, culturally kind of prioritize what we're doing in Iowa? There's not a huge disincentive to not following the rules, if that's what we're doing.
So I have a question, Dane. Is it possible that that we could have like just a presentation for the legislators? I guess obviously it would have to probably be with somebody who cares about this. But is there a way that they could have like a briefing, like even a presentation that would just go over some of the facts and figures that we know of? Like some of the people, even in our state, as you said, they're so busy because they have so many other things going on. But what if they had like a presentation that could educate them just about some of the basic facts, like, over half of our farmland is rented, and those renters are not going to take in to consideration that they could put good conservation on the land. Some of these facts, that 86% of our landscape is covered by an intensive two-crop system of corn and beans with 25 million pigs at any given minute and 54 million chickens on any given day. And what an impact all of this has, in addition to all the chemicals and everything else that are put on the landscape. I don't think a lot of people know that. And is it possible that they could have just a briefing of of this example from the Polk County Conservation Report that was, a public hearing was at the Harkin Institute, and they have some presentations that they've been briefing to get people out to learn more about how to present this data. Is that possible that we could actually have, like the Izaak Walton League could even host something like that, where you as the lobbyist or something could get a couple of representatives to participate just so that we could, I mean, maybe that's not realistic. I don't know what the options are, but how could we,
Yeah.
how could we do that, to brief them?
I think, well, you can do it, and I think, the method or the mechanism by which you want to do that is, kind of up to you, or might be better with lots of groups doing it. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
shying away from doing it
Right.
myself, but and that event at the Harkin Institute, I unfortunately couldn't attend, but I know it was really well attended and very informative. And I think, yeah, something like that would be very helpful. I also would say, I mean, my experience from the 2017 kind of 18 session when they were dealing with the water quality issue was that there was a disconnect. Certainly back then, it's, like I said, been almost 10 years since that went through,
Mhm.
of legislators who really weren't aware of some of these more just fundamental facts that you're talking about, Christine. And I think it's
Mhm.
probably true now again.
Yeah.
And I think when legislators, or just people in general, which legislators are aware of those, it starts to change. It brings on new thinking, right? About how is it that we're going to deal with this problem. And
Right.
other people get interested in it besides just those that kind of care about it because they're really close to the industry. They might farm themselves, or they're very close with, name the organization out there that might stand to thwart progress. And so I do think it's helpful. Not that it would necessarily, I think, change minds, but it would, to your point, um, provide a lot of education for people to have a fundamental grasp of what's going on.
Mhm.
I remember representing the waterworks, and there was, once you talked with legislators about what it is that they face and how nitrate gets into the water and what the dynamics are in terms of removing it and the impact that it has. Um, it was amazing how many people, how many legislators, Republican legislators, um, once they learned about that, kind of had a different perspective, or at least a tone that shifted about what they were dealing with. So I think it's a good idea. The
Yeah.
question is kind of how best to execute it.
That sounds like something that I think would be uh, advantageous for several of these groups that want to see, well, first of all, let's get the monitors on as a priority and why. Just a summary of about, how this affects everybody. And look at, we continue to be front page Washington Post this morning with cancer rates in young children, or young adults. Um, and I think some of those stats are also pretty compelling. And we know that it's not just the nitrates, it's all of the other things that are going into the, I mean, it's a toxic recipe for cancer.
Yeah.
And, whether it's a point source or not, but we have to be realistic, and people have to, I mean, almost all of us know somebody who has is in, if it's not a relative, it's a friend, and we're all, living in this area. So, I mean, this is Iowa, right? Um, and it looks like, Chris, I think Jill has a question in there too, and then maybe another question before that. So I'll let a couple other people, I won't try to occupy the evening with questions. So thank you, Dane.
Yep.
So Jill's question, Jill Crafton from Wisconsin or Minnesota?
Minnesota.
Okay. Is there a process for bringing folks together around healthcare concerns as a starter? And yeah, maybe you can weigh in on that. And there might be others in the audience who know something about what's already happening around that. Dane, do you want to weigh in on that one?
I can, and yeah, some others, Chris, I don't, maybe you're alluding to exactly what I thought of, may know it better. I do know that, last year in the governor's State of the State address, she mentioned, this high cancer rate that Iowa has, growing cancer rate that Iowa has, even, it's age adjusted. So, of course, we're an older state demographically than maybe all of them. We're way up there. But even when you age adjust it, we've got more cancer rates than every state in the country except for Kentucky, which is kind of beset by lung cancer. And so there has been over the interim, and there was they had a meeting 2 or 3 or maybe 4 weeks ago now. I think it was out of DMAC, a group of stakeholders kind of talking about making a start on trying to assess why it is the case that we have that higher cancer rate. And, it's a complicated issue. Of course, it's epidemiology, and it's not easy to come up with come up with solutions for that. But there is, at least to Jill's question, something out there in terms of a process for getting people together around healthcare concerns. There's going to be, a lot of competing kind of bad guys, for, if you will, for why we've got a lot of cancer in Iowa. It's gonna, we have high binge drinking rates, of course, high drinking rates, period. We're up there with, at the top of that list also around the United States, if you look at that data. But, agricultural practices, could be in there. I'm not sure. I'm not too familiar with the work that committee's undertaking or what all they're looking at, but they apparently are going to look at everything. How closely they look at agricultural practices, probably a jump ball. And they've, what's also been discussed, of course, are things like radon, where, we've got a lot of that in all of our houses, or at least most of us do, and how we mitigate that. So whether or not we could get folks to, draw the causal link between the practices that we have and the situation we have in Iowa and high cancer rates is, I'm not sure, but at least there is the impetus for a discussion about it that's starting to take shape and might have some final work product for us to look at as we get closer to the session starting, with some ideas.
So as we go to another question, perhaps I can mention that Iowa Farmers Union, Iowa Environmental Council, the Harkin Institute are all working around the healthcare concerns and the water concerns. And I've been to several policy meetings and so forth and so on. Maybe didn't I see John Norris on here somewhere? Anyway, that at the Harkin Institute, they are working on this. Would you want to mention some of that, John?
Yeah, well, we had our first policy meeting last Wednesday, and we're working. It's going to take a while. We're just working through the process of coming up a list of policies and prioritize which order we think people have the most impact on water quality. We have a lot more ideas on the state side, but we're also going to work on the farm bill and the federal side. And our next meeting is next week. And then at the town hall meeting on November 15th, we'll give a little presentation on where we're at so far.
And maybe Christine, you can find or share with others when you put out the recording, the information about those and the links to some of the policies and so forth, or some of the other things that are going on.
Sure.
Or in the CISRA report. I see, Jill, you have another question. You have your hand up.
I'm thinking, Dane, I may have met you in Minneapolis area at something that the Great Plains Institute hosted about 10 years ago. But anyway, what we have done here in Minnesota was we brought a whole lot of groups together and had to learn how to work together so that we were singing the same song at the legislature. But it sounds like kind of what you're talking about at the Harkin Institute might have some relevance to that. But that was what it took, was to just bring everybody together, and we had to learn to prioritize and pick the highest things that we could work on all together so that everybody was working together toward a common goal. So I don't know if that's something that you can make happen down there, but that was kind of how we got things going up here in Minnesota.
Thanks, Jill. Good recommendation. Anybody else?
Wow, it's 8
Oh,
o'clock.
here's a nice long one.
Okay.
This will get us out through the end here, I'll bet you. As from Glenn, as I view it, nitrates by themselves in controlled amounts are beneficial, especially to plant growth. Yes, that's true. Chicken manure, for instance, is great lawn fertilizer, but the concentration in confined geographical areas is the problem. I might mention, so is the spreading of it on my neighbor's organic field, which I didn't know was happening yesterday. And boy, I got a good whiff of it on the half a mile past, and then then turned the corner and another half a mile past that yesterday afternoon. So thinking like an entrepreneur, doesn't this present an opportunity for a new industry that would diffuse the concentration through collection, processing, and distribution to homeowners while providing the green lawns that most homeowners seek? Good question. And my question would be, would homeowners even be enough? So
That's true. With the concentrated,
it's a concentrated product, all right.
yeah, and when it already covers 86% of our landscape. So the urban areas are very small compared to that.
Yeah.
It sounds,
Oh, you're muted, Dane. There you go.
Well, when I was, um, I guess what I would do is turn it back to what I was kind of talking about is, there's ideas that we can have that the IDOLs can have, the legislature can have, and we've got to kind of come up with that stuff through the political process. But I think the more that we try to do this by empowering individuals to get together and make these changes or come up with these solutions, right, and let kind of 1,000 flowers bloom, so to speak, and come up with these ideas for how we deal with this issue, right? I mean, maybe there's a cooperative somewhere that wants to take chicken manure and give it out to people at a low price and make some money in the process, or just cover their costs and, make lawns look prettier and, name the town. I don't know that there's necessarily, I can't sit in judgment of what's good or bad ideas. Because I don't think any of us really know until some of this stuff just gets tried. And if we can set up a mechanism for that to happen, or mechanisms for that to happen, maybe there are crazy things that can work, and none of us really know it yet.
well, we do know, I mean, luckily there's been a lot of great research and a lot of, research and science behind all this. So we know what needs to be done. Is a lot of it is just implementing them. And as you said, we can't really put regulations here in Iowa in place. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this situation that we have on the ground. If everybody would, farm a certain way, and if we had half the land that is rented, if we had, homeowners back on the land that were actually living there, I don't think we would see, a lot of these issues that, if we truly had the family farms going on like we used to. But that is not Iowa anymore.
That's true. We all know the economics of farming have changed, and so has some of the ethos surrounding it also, right? With just not having families on the farms like that.
Yeah.
This has been a great hour, Christine, and we're running at 8:04 already. So I think I don't have anything else in the chat from anybody. So you want to do your wrap up?
Sure. We're super grateful that all of you have taken this time to be with us this evening, and especially Dane, who's super busy and is at the Capitol quite a bit and working with legislators, and he really understands the whole dynamic. So we really appreciate your perspective, and I like that idea of maybe, we can work with the Harkin Institute and the policy committee that are getting together, and maybe that is an idea that we have a session where we can present this to the legislation, at the Capitol, and just give an overview of what the study is about and what the results are, and how can we bring this to the forefront. So
I think that'd be a good idea. Yeah, and thanks for having me too. So I appreciate it.
thank you very much. Everybody have a great week. This is recorded, so we'll have it up on our website, and it'll be shared out, and all of our Watershed Talks are recorded, and we'll keep you posted. Look out for emails with next month. We have a couple of possibilities right now, and since there's so many hot topics right now, we try to keep everything active and up in front. So thank you again, Dane. Have a beautiful week, everybody, and we'll be in touch.
You're welcome. See you.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you.